The freight boy smelled wet harness leather and stove smoke leaking from the pipe above him. Sleet ticked on the porch roof of the store. Inside, a ledger slid across the pine counter, and a woman's hand, cracked at the knuckles, dirt pressed into the lines, stopped it. She stared at the figures. The storekeeper watched her the way a man watches an animal deciding whether to bolt. Nobody on the bench moved. Nobody said a word for her. Then the storekeeper closed the book and said something the freight boy could not hear, and whatever it was made the woman wrap her shawl tighter around a sack of meal and walk out into the sleet without looking back. The boy watched her cross the mud street toward a road that climbed 15 miles into the mountains. He did not know her name. He did not know that the road she was walking would close within days, or that the place she was walking toward could not keep her alive. 3 weeks before the sleet, before the store, before Royce Ketchum's ledger slid across the counter with her father's name scratched through, Alma Whitcomb had stood on a grade road 15 miles above Murphy's, California, and watched two men lift Merritt Whitcomb's body from under an overturned freight wagon. The mules had spooked on wet gravel. The wagon caught a rut and rolled. Merritt's neck broke against the iron rim of his own wheel. He was 46. He left behind a half-paid squatter's claim, a set of kiln tools, one mule with a swollen shoulder, and a daughter who had never wintered alone above 4,000 feet. That was October of 1873. By November, Alma had buried him in rocky ground using a borrowed shovel, returned the shovel, and counted what remained. $16.40, folded inside a tobacco tin Merritt kept in his boot. 100 pounds of flour in a canvas sack already stained with damp. 18 pounds of dried beans. 2 pounds of salt pork wrapped in burlap. One axe with a handle her father had shaped from white oak. One handsaw missing 3 teeth. A cracked mercury thermometer Merritt had carried from Missouri, the glass tube clouded but readable, and less than 1 cord of split pine stacked against the north wall of a claim cabin that was not finished and never would be. The cabin sat in a clearing east of the Calaveras North Grove, on a slope where giant sequoias grew so wide that 2 men could not join hands around a trunk. The land was beautiful in summer. In winter, snow could bury a standing horse. Alma did not know how much wood she needed. She knew what the cabin looked like. 4 walls of rough-sawn boards with gaps she could press her thumb through, a plank roof that had already begun to sag under its first autumn rain, a stone hearth her father had started but never chinked, and a door that hung from leather hinges and did not close flush. Wind moved through the cabin the way water moves through a net. She could feel it sitting still. She needed someone to tell her the math. She did not have to wait long. Asa Pettigrew arrived on a Tuesday morning, riding a dun mare with a farrier's apron rolled behind the saddle. Asa was 62, a former road crew foreman who had built cabins, bridges, and ore chutes in these mountains since 1855. He had known Merritt. He had liked Merritt. He did not like what he saw when he stepped off the mare and walked the property line. He moved slowly, the way a man moves when he is counting damage. He pressed his boot against the north wall and watched it flex. He crouched at the hearth and put his hand over the gap between stone and board. He looked at the roof, looked at the woodpile, and then he looked at Alma. "You have chinks a finger wide," Asa said. "You have a roof that drinks snow. You have maybe 1.5 cords stacked, if you count the green pieces, which I would not. You need 6 cords minimum to keep a stove fed through a Sierra winter in a cabin this leaky, more like 8 if the cold sets early." Alma said nothing. She had been doing her own arithmetic since the funeral, and the numbers had not improved with repetition. "Your father was a strong man, and he could not finish this cabin alone," Asa said. "It would take a crew of 3 another month to chink these walls, fix that roof, and split enough wood. You have no crew. You have no month. The first real snow could come in 3 weeks, or it could come tomorrow." He walked to the woodpile and kicked the base of the stack. 2 pieces tumbled. Green pine, heavy with sap that would smoke more than it would burn. "Miss Whitcomb," Asa said, "I do not say this to be cruel. I say it because your father would want someone to say it. A woman alone does not keep a winter claim at this elevation. Not with these walls, not with this wood." The words landed the way cold water lands, sudden and total. Alma felt them in her chest. She also felt something behind them, something Asa probably did not intend, a door closing. If she left, she lost the claim. If she stayed, Asa believed she would die. "Where would I go?" Alma said. Not a question, a measurement. Asa had no answer that worked. The mule could not descend the grade with its shoulders swollen to the size of a melon. Stage passage to Stockton cost more than the tobacco tin held. Her nearest kin were in Pike County, Missouri, and a letter would not reach them before spring even if she had the postage. She was 15 miles above the nearest town, on a claim held together by nails her father had straightened from salvage, with a debt note Merritt had signed at Royce Ketchum's store. The debt. That was the lock on the cage. Alma had not known the full amount until the week after the burial, when she walked to Murphy's for flour and salt and stood at Royce Ketchum's counter. Royce was 46, a storekeeper who also speculated in timber leases and bought distressed claims the way other men bought livestock, patiently, knowing Winter would do the negotiating for him. He had a clean collar and a ledger bound in cowhide and a way of looking at people that suggested he was already calculating their salvage value. "Your father owed $11.60, Royce said, pushing the ledger across the pine counter so Alma could see the figures. "Flour, nails, rope, axle grease, credited against future hauling work that will not be performed." Alma stared at the numbers. Merritt's handwriting, his mark beside each entry, a crooked M he had used since Missouri because his full signature took too long. "I will work it off," Alma said. Royce closed the ledger. "There is no hauling work for a woman with a lame mule. I have bought the note. If you abandon the claim before spring, the tools, the mule, and the cabin revert to cover the balance." The store was warm. A potbelly stove ticked in the corner. 2 men at the back bench looked at their boots. Nobody spoke for Alma because speaking for her would mean speaking against Royce, and Royce held paper on half the claims above Murphy's. "I am not abandoning the claim," Alma said. Royce smiled the way a man smiles when he has already won and wants the other person to understand it slowly. "Winter will make that decision for you, Miss Whitcomb. I am simply offering terms before it does." She left the store with a 10-pound sack of cornmeal she paid for with coins from the tobacco tin. $6.40 remained. The sky was the color of hammered tin. Sleet clicked against the porch roof as she stepped outside. A freight boy holding a mule team watched her cross the mud street. He saw her wrap a torn shawl tighter around the flour sack. He saw her boots, cracked at the sole. He saw her face, and whatever was on it made him look away. The road crew foreman, a man named Duthie, stopped Alma at the edge of town. "Storm coming," he said. "Could be early this year. The aspens dropped a week ahead of normal." Alma thanked him and kept walking. She had 15 miles to cover before dark, carrying cornmeal and salt on a road that was already turning to grease under the sleet. She made it 9 miles before the sleet turned to snow. The flakes came thick and sideways, driven by a wind that had no patience. The road ruts filled. The trail markers, blazed stumps Merritt had taught her to watch for, disappeared under white. Alma's hands went numb inside her gloves, then her wrists, then her forearms. The cornmeal sack grew heavy with moisture. She shifted it to her other hip and stumbled on a root she could not see. The mule was back at the cabin, useless. Alma was on foot, 2 miles short of the claim, carrying food she could not afford to drop and wearing boots that let snow in through the cracks like the cabin let wind. She lost the trail at the place where the road forked toward the North Grove. Snow had erased the distinction between path and hillside. She went left because left felt like uphill, and the cabin was uphill. She was wrong. The ground dropped into a ravine choked with deadfall, and she slid 15 feet before catching a branch that tore the skin from her right palm. She sat in the snow at the bottom of the ravine and felt the cold settle around her like something alive. The light was going. The snow was not stopping. She had perhaps an hour before dark, and perhaps 2 hours after dark before the temperature killed her. That was when she smelled char, Not smoke, char. Old fire. The black, flat scent of wood that burned a long time ago and has been wet and dried and wet again. She followed the smell through a thicket of young fir, pushing branches aside with her bleeding hand, and came out into a clearing where a giant sequoia lay on its side like a fallen cathedral. The tree was enormous. 70 feet of trunk stretched across the forest floor, the root ball torn from the earth and standing vertical at one end like a wall of tangled wood and stone. The butt end was nearly 20 feet across. A fire, perhaps lightning, perhaps decades old, had hollowed the interior through much of its length, leaving a blackened chamber roofed by bark thick enough to stop a bullet. The opening gaped like a mouth, dark and still. Alma crawled inside. She did not think about what she was doing. She thought about getting out of the wind. The interior was dark, dry, and silent. The wind, which had been tearing at her shawl and driving snow into her eyes, stopped. Not gradually, completely, as if she had stepped through a wall. She lay on the charred floor of the log and breathed. Her hands shook, her teeth knocked together, but the air around her face was not moving, and that single fact, still air, changed everything. She thought of Merritt, not the wagon, not the burial. She thought of a summer afternoon in Pike County when she was 11 and her father had taken her to the lime kiln where he worked. The kiln was a stone chamber built into a hillside, fed with wood and limestone, burning at temperatures that turned rock to powder. Merritt had pressed his palm against the kiln door, a thick slab of clay and iron, and told Alma to do the same. "Feel that," he said. The door was warm, but not hot. On the other side, the fire was eating stone. "Heat does not only escape through walls," Merritt said. He moved his hand to a crack where the door met the frame. Hot air rushed through the gap like breath. "It escapes through moving air. A crack the width of a hair can drain a kiln faster than a wall the width of your hand." He had smeared wet clay into the crack with his thumb and made Alma hold her palm near the sealed seam. The rushing air stopped. The door grew warmer because the heat had nowhere to go. "Seal the cracks," Merritt said. "That is the whole lesson. Everything else is furniture." Alma had filed that lesson in the place children file, things their parents say, present but dormant, waiting for relevance. Relevance had arrived. She lay in the dark chamber of the fallen sequoia and felt the air. Still. The massive walls of wood, bark, and heartwood combined, some of it nearly 2 feet thick, surrounded her on every side except the opening. The charred interior was dry. Snow did not penetrate deeper than the first few feet of the mouth. The wind hit the outside of the log and went around it, the way water goes around a boulder in a creek. Alma dug into her coat and found the tin of matches she carried. She struck one. The flame lit the interior in orange and shadow. The chamber was roughly 8 feet wide at this point and perhaps 5 feet high, large enough to sit up in, large enough to lie down in, large enough to build a fire in if the smoke had somewhere to go. She gathered pitch slivers from the charred walls and a handful of dead twigs that had blown inside. She built a fire no larger than her 2 fists pressed together and lit it. The flames caught. The smoke rose. And then it did something she did not expect. It climbed toward a scar in the upper wall of the log, a place where the old fire had burned through the wood and slipped through the gap like thread through a needle. The smoke left. The heat stayed. Within minutes, the air around Alma's face was warm enough that her teeth stopped knocking. The fire was tiny. In the claim cabin, a fire this size would have been meaningless. The heat would have leaked through every crack and gap before it reached her skin. Here, inside this chamber of ancient wood, the heat had nowhere to go. The walls held it. The bark insulated it. The still air kept it close. Alma held her bleeding hand near the fire and watched steam rise from her wet gloves. She was not warm. She was alive, and she understood why. The log was not a cave. It was an insulated chamber. The thick walls blocked wind. The massive wood shell slowed heat loss. The charred interior did not absorb moisture, and the natural ventilation, low opening for intake, high scar for exhaust, moved smoke out without moving heat out. Alma pressed her palm against the inner wall of the log, the way Merritt had pressed his palm against the kiln door. Warm. She did not sleep that night. She fed the fire with small sticks, kept her hands near the flames, and listened to the storm tear through the canopy above her. Snow piled against the outside of the log. Wind screamed through the grove. Inside, the air was still, and the fire burned steady, and the temperature held. By morning, the storm had passed. Alma crawled out of the log into a world of white. The trail was gone. Snow reached her knees. She could see, a quarter-mile downhill, the faint rectangle of her father's claim cabin with its sagging roof already bowed under the weight. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the log. The cabin needed 6 cords of wood, a crew of 3, and a month of labor she did not have. The log needed mud, stones, and the knowledge her father had given her in a kiln yard in Missouri. Alma made the decision standing in snow to her shins with a torn flour sack and a bleeding hand and $6.40 to her name. She would not fix the cabin. She would move into the tree. The idea was insane. She knew it was insane. A woman living inside a fallen log like a hibernating animal, patching the entrance with mud and stone, burning twigs while the mountain threw everything it had at the bark. Asa would call it suicide. Royce would call it abandonment. Phoebe Mallory, her nearest neighbor, would call it grief madness, but the math worked. The log did not need 6 cords. It did not need chinked walls, or a new roof, or a crew. It needed what Alma could carry: clay, stone, small wood, and the patience to seal every crack the way Merritt had sealed the kiln door. She went back to the cabin. She packed what she could carry: the skillet, the blanket, the kettle, the axe, the beans, a portion of the flour, Merritt's auger, the cracked thermometer, twine, and nails she had pulled from a broken feed box. She loaded the flour into a canvas sack, strapped the tools to her back, and walked into the grove. It took her 2 days to make 6 trips between the cabin and the log, hauling everything that mattered. Each trip was 1.25 miles through snow that ranged from knee-deep to waist-deep in the drifts. Her boots split on the second trip. She wrapped her feet in flour sacking and kept walking. By the 3rd trip, the flour sacking was soaked through and her toes were white at the tips. By the 5th trip, she was dragging the last sack of beans on a pine branch because her arms could no longer lift it. On the 6th trip, she brought the thermometer. She hung it from a nail inside the log and read it by firelight. 38 degrees. Outside, the thermometer she had nailed to the cabin porch read 26. 12 degrees of difference, and she had not yet sealed a single crack. Phoebe Mallory found her on the 3rd morning. Phoebe was 31, a neighbor who lived in a proper cabin a half-mile east with her husband and 2 boys. Her husband hauled timber for a mill crew and was gone weeks at a time. Phoebe was sharp-eyed, capable, and worried about everything, in that order. She had come looking for Alma's lame mule, which had broken its tether and wandered toward the creek. She did not find the mule. She found Alma on her knees at the mouth of a fallen sequoia, packing wet clay between stones she had stacked into a low wall across the opening. Phoebe stood at the edge of the clearing and stared. "Alma?" she said. "What are you doing?" Alma pressed a stone into the clay and did not look up. "Building a wall. Inside a tree. Across the mouth of a tree. The wall is the door." Phoebe came closer. She could see soot on the bark above the opening. She could smell smoke. Thin smoke, not the heavy reek of a cabin fire, but a thread of gray rising from a blackened scar 12 feet above the ground. She could see, through the gap above the half-built wall, the orange flicker of a small fire and the shape of a blanket spread on a raised platform of branches. "Alma?" Phoebe said again. Her voice had changed. It was the voice women use when they believe someone they care about has lost the ability to make sound decisions. "You cannot winter inside a burned tree." "The cabin cannot keep heat," Alma said. "This can." "Smoke will kill you." Alma picked up a rag from the ground, a strip of flour sacking, and held it near the base of the stone wall, at a gap she had left the width of her fist. The rag pulled inward, sucked by the draft. Then she held the rag near the scar above. The rag pushed outward as warm air and smoke rose through the gap. The air comes in low and goes out high, Alma said. The fire draws it through. The smoke never pools. Phoebe watched the demonstration with her arms crossed. The science was visible. The conclusion was not. Bears use hollow logs, Phoebe said. Not this one. The fire keeps them out. A thaw will flood you. The log sits on a slope. Water runs downhill. No decent person can winter inside a burned tree, Alma. People will say you have lost your mind. Alma looked at Phoebe for the first time. Her face was streaked with soot, and her right hand was wrapped in a strip of burlap where the ravine branch had torn the skin. She looked like someone who had stopped caring what people said approximately 3 days ago. People can say what they like, Alma said. I need to survive until spring. The cabin will not do it. This might. Phoebe left without agreeing or arguing further. She came back an hour later with a jar of milk and a pair of wool socks her husband would not miss. She set them at the mouth of the log without stepping inside, the way a person leaves food for an animal they are not sure is tame. Word reached Murphy's within 2 days. It reached Royce Ketchum's store within 3. Royce heard the story from a timber hauler who had passed Phoebe on the road. The Whitcomb girl has moved into a hollow log, the hauler said, grinning. She's walling herself inside a rotten tree. Royce did not grin. He set down his pen and thought about what this meant for his investment. The claim cabin was the legal anchor of Merritt's squatter improvement. If Alma stopped sleeping in the cabin, Royce could argue abandonment. If she died in the log, the claim reverted and the debt wiped clean, and Royce could file on the land himself. The meadow trail that crossed the claim was worth more to his timber operation than anything Merritt had ever owed him. But if Alma survived the winter inside a tree, the story would make her impossible to evict. Nobody forces a woman off land she nearly died defending. Royce needed her to fail, and he needed the failure to look like her own decision. He started at the store. Miss Whitcomb has taken up housekeeping inside firewood, he said to 3 men buying nails. The line was good. It traveled. Within a week, it had become the way people in Murphy's described Alma's situation, half pity, half joke, entirely dismissive. The laughter mattered more than Royce intended. Laughter is a verdict that requires no evidence. Once the men at the nail counter repeated the joke, housekeeping inside firewood, the phrase spread to the timber camps, to the road crews, to the women drawing water at the flume. It became the way people referred to Alma without saying her name. The Whitcomb girl, the one in the log. The timber haulers shook their heads. The millwives clucked. Even people who had never met Alma felt licensed to pity her, which is a kind of burial that does not require a body. Royce sent Asa Pettigrew to talk sense into her. Asa had credibility. He had built structures in these mountains for nearly 20 years. If Asa came back saying the log was a death trap, Royce could use that opinion to justify a welfare check, an abandonment filing, or both. Asa rode to the grove on a cold morning with frost on his beard and doubt in his chest. He did not want to make this ride. He had liked Merritt, and he did not enjoy watching Merritt's daughter do something that looked, from any reasonable distance, like a slow form of surrender. He expected to find Alma shivering in a hole, talking to herself about kilns. He did not find that. He found a stone and clay wall knee-high across the mouth of the log, with a crawl entrance covered by a canvas flap. He found a fire ring made of flat stones 6 feet inside the entrance, burning a handful of twigs no thicker than his thumb. He found a sleeping shelf built from split cedar poles and layered with pine boughs. He found a smoke scar in the upper wall that pulled draft as clean as any chimney he had built. And he found the thermometer. The air outside was 34 degrees. Asa ducked through the crawl entrance, straightened inside the chamber, and looked at the mercury line. 52 degrees. With a fire smaller than what Asa used to light his pipe. He stood in the warm dark of the log and said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at the stone wall, at the clay chinking, at the intake vent, at the smoke scar. at the sleeping shelf, at the drying rack Alma had made from willow switches. "Who taught you this?" Asa said. "My father," Alma said. "He burned lime." Asa walked back to Murphy's and told Royce the log was peculiar but not immediately dangerous. He did not endorse it. He did not condemn it. He also did not laugh, and Royce noticed the absence. "She will be dead by January," Royce said. Asa pulled on his gloves. "Maybe," he said, "but she is warmer than I expected." That answer cost Royce his certainty, and a man like Royce without certainty becomes a man with plans. He moved quickly. He visited Phoebe's husband on the timber road and mentioned casually that anyone who helped Alma live outside the cabin was helping her abandon the legal claim. He told the road crew foreman that if Alma froze, the county might hold people responsible who knew she was in danger and did nothing to stop her. He offered to buy Alma's tools, the axe, the saw, the auger, for $8 before snow buries them. Alma refused. Royce then mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he might file an abandonment notice if Alma spent too many consecutive nights away from the cabin improvement. The threat was precise. Abandonment did not require Alma to be dead. It only required her to stop using the cabin as her primary dwelling. If Royce could prove she had moved to the log, the claim was his. Alma heard the threat from Phoebe, who heard it from her husband, who heard it from Royce. The chain of warning was itself a demonstration of how small the world was and how large Royce loomed inside it. "You cannot pay debt with smoke and mud," Royce told Alma directly when she came to the store for salt. His voice was calm, almost kind, the way creditors speak when they believe time is on their side. "No," Alma said, "but I can keep my hands alive long enough to work." "Spring belongs to whoever is still standing," Royce said. Alma counted 4 pennies onto the counter for the salt. "Then come back in spring," she said. She walked out into the cold carrying a paper twist of salt in a rage so dense it felt like fuel. The construction had begun in earnest, and it was harder than anything Alma had done in her life. The stone and clay wall across the log mouth needed to be solid enough to block wind, but porous enough at the base to let fresh air feed the fire. Alma gathered stones from the creek bed a quarter-mile downhill, carrying them in her skirt because she had no bucket, and the canvas sacks were needed for food storage. Each stone weighed between 5 and 20 pounds. She needed dozens. Her hands cracked and bled. By the 4th trip, the skin on her fingers had split along the knuckles, and she could see pink tissue beneath the calluses that should have protected her. The clay she dug from a frozen bank came out in chunks that had to be softened with water she heated in the kettle over the small fire. Water she carried from the same creek where she gathered stones, in the same kettle she cooked beans in, because she had one kettle. Every task fed another task and starved a third. Time spent gathering stones was time not spent gathering wood. Time spent heating water for clay was time not spent heating water for cooking. Time spent climbing to clear the smoke vent was time not spent building the wall. The days were short. Sunlight lasted 9 hours if the sky was clear, fewer if clouds sat on the ridge. Alma worked from first gray light to last, stopping only when her hands shook too badly to place stones. She mixed the clay with what she had: creek sand, wood ash from the fire, and dry grass she pulled from under snow at the edge of the clearing. The mixture was her father's kiln recipe, adapted from memory. Merritt had used it to seal cracks in limestone kilns that held temperatures hot enough to calcine rock. If it could hold kiln heat, it could hold body heat. But memory is not mastery, and Alma knew she was guessing at proportions Merritt had learned through years of practice. She ate once a day, beans cooked in the kettle with a shaving of salt pork for flavor. The flour she rationed to a half-cup scoop, mixed with water, and baked on a flat stone near the fire. The cornmeal from Murphy's was already half gone. She calculated what remained against the months ahead, and the numbers made her stop chewing for a moment before she resumed. Hunger was a constant now, not sharp, but heavy, like a stone she carried inside her chest that grew slightly larger each morning. Day 5. The wall was knee-high, and the fire smoked so badly that Alma's eyes watered for an hour after she let the flames die. The smoke scar was not drawing well. The char inside the vent had constricted the passage, and wet bark above was sealing it further with each freeze. She climbed on top of the log, a terrifying scramble up bark ridges as deep as ladder rungs, and cleared the scar with the auger, boring through char and soft wood until daylight showed through. When she climbed down and relit the fire, the smoke rose fast and clean. But the effort had taken a full day, and she had not gathered a single stone. Day 7. The wall reached her waist. She built the crawl entrance at the base. An opening 2 feet wide and 18 inches high, just large enough to push through on her belly. She lined the entrance with flat stones to keep the clay from crumbling under traffic. She hung a doubled canvas flap over the outside, weighted with a branch. The temperature inside, with the wall half built and the fire burning, read 47 degrees. Outside, it was 29. The improvement was measurable. It was also not enough. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Day 8. Alma cleared the smoke scar wider and lined it with flat stones she had chipped to shape with the back of the axe head. The interior reached 58 degrees after 1 hour of steady fire, but the fire consumed her wood faster than she expected, and the deadfall within easy walking distance was running thin. She would need to range farther, which meant more time away from construction, which meant fewer days before winter shut the door. Day 9. The temperature dropped overnight and the clay wall cracked. Not a small crack. A fracture that ran from the base to the top of the wall on the windward side, splitting the mud like bread crust. Cold air poured through the gap, and the interior temperature fell 12 degrees in an hour. The thermometer, which had read 51 when Alma fell asleep, read 39 when she woke shivering in the dark. The fire had burned down to embers, and the embers were not enough to fight the draft now screaming through the fissure. Alma rebuilt the fire and held her hands near the flames and watched the crack. She could see daylight through it. She could feel the wind. Everything she had carried and stacked and pressed into place over 8 days was now a wall with a wound, and the wound was growing as frozen clay contracted in the cold. She pressed clay into the crack with her bare hands. It held for 20 minutes, then the freeze drove it out again. She tried again with wetter clay, packing it deep, smoothing the surface. It froze solid by afternoon and cracked again that night, the fracture widening by the width of a finger. The clay was wrong. She was mixing it the way Merritt had taught her, but Merritt's kilns were sheltered from freezing. The clay here froze before it cured, and freezing expanded the water inside it and turned it brittle. She needed a different formula, more binder, less water, something to give the clay flexibility against the freeze cycle, and she did not have one. She would have to tear out half the work and start again. Not repair. Demolish and rebuild. The weight of that realization, the lost time, the wasted labor, the crack that mocked every stone she had carried from the creek, was heavier than any stone she had lifted. She sat on the sleeping shelf with her cracked hands pressed between her knees and her split boots dark with moisture and her $6.40 minus the salt. And she felt the doubt that Asa had planted and Royce had watered begin to bloom in her chest like frost on glass. Maybe they were right. Maybe a woman alone could not keep a winter claim. Maybe the tree was a coffin she was building around herself, and the only question was whether cold or smoke or pride would kill her first. Asa's voice in her memory, 6 chords or a coffin. Royce's smile across the counter. Phoebe's jar of milk left outside the entrance like an offering to the already dead. Alma looked at her father's thermometer. 39 degrees and falling. The crack in the wall hissed with wind. She needed someone who knew clay the way Merritt had known lime, not from a book, not from a single lesson remembered through the fog of childhood, but from years of working the material until their hands understood what their words could not explain. Outside the log, snow began to fall again. Inside, the fire hissed, and the crack in the wall breathed cold air, and Alma Whitcomb had 11 days before the wagon road closed for winter. She found Alma the way people in the mountains find each other, by accident, which is another word for necessity. Doña Estefania Robles was 58 years old, a California widow who had lived in these mountains longer than any American settler and longer than most of them cared to acknowledge. She had been a charcoal burner, an herb gatherer, a cook for road crews, and before all of that, a woman who had built earth ovens and adobe hearths in the years when California still spoke Spanish. She knew fire the way a midwife knows labor, not from theory, but from standing close to it for decades and learning what it did when no one was watching. She found Alma on the 10th morning at the frozen clay bank below the creek crossing. Alma was on her knees in the snow, digging clay with the back of the axe head because the ground was too hard for her hands. Her knuckles were bleeding through the burlap wraps. The clay came out in chunks the color of old bone, and Alma stacked them in her skirt the way she stacked everything. Carefully, because dropping anything meant bending to pick it up, and bending had become a negotiation with muscles that no longer cooperated without argument. Estefania stood at the top of the bank and watched for a full minute before she spoke. She had been gathering dried yarrow and willow bark from a stand of trees a quarter-mile east. She carried a canvas bag stained with herb dust and a walking stick carved from manzanita. She wore a wool coat that had been patched so many times the original fabric was a matter of speculation. "Your clay will crack," Estefania said. Alma looked up. She saw a woman she did not recognize, dark-haired, brown-skinned, with hands as rough as the manzanita stick and eyes that were not pitying. That was the first thing Alma noticed. Everyone else who looked at her, Asa, Phoebe, Royce, the men at the store, looked at her with some version of pity, even when the pity was wrapped in contempt. This woman looked at her the way a carpenter looks at a joint that has been cut wrong. Assessment, not sympathy. "I know," Alma said. "It froze overnight and split from the base to the top." "How are you mixing it?" "Clay, sand, ash, dry grass. My father used this formula on kilns." "Your father's kilns did not freeze." Estefania came down the bank in 3 long steps, her stick punching through the crust. She picked up a chunk of Alma's clay, broke it between her fingers, and rubbed the fragments together. "Too much water. You need charcoal ash, not wood ash. Charcoal ash has calcium and grit, and sand in equal measure to the clay, not half. Sand gives the wall teeth. The teeth hold when water turns to ice." She looked at Alma's hands. She looked at the blood on the burlap. She looked at the axe head Alma was using as a digging tool. "Show me the tree," Estefania said. Alma brought her to the log. She expected the same reaction Phoebe had given: disbelief, then concern, then withdrawal. Estefania gave none of these. She ducked through the crawl entrance, stood inside the chamber, and turned in a slow circle. She looked at the cracked wall. She looked at the fire ring. She looked at the smoke scar overhead. She looked at the sleeping shelf, the intake vent, the drying rack. Then she crouched beside the fire and lit a twist of dry grass. She held it near the intake vent and watched the flame bend inward. She moved the burning grass to the smoke scar and watched the flame pull upward. She nodded once, a small, vertical movement that carried the weight of professional approval. "You have the shape right," Estefania said. "The fire is too large and the wall is too wet, but the shape is right. Who taught you draft?" "My father. He burned lime." "Lime men know heat. They do not always know cold." Estefania dropped the burning grass into the fire ring and straightened. "I will teach you the cold part." She did not ask permission. She did not offer charity. She recognized something in Alma's work, the correct instinct, the wrong execution, and she responded to it the way any craftsperson responds to talent that needs correction. Not with generosity, but with impatience to see the thing done right. They started that afternoon. The first lesson was clay tempering. Estefania sent Alma to gather charcoal ash from an old burn site a half-mile west. Not wood ash, which was too fine and too powdery, but charcoal ash, which was coarser and carried calcium from the minerals in the charred wood. She made Alma sift the ash through her fingers until only the gritty particles remained. Then she mixed the clay herself. showing Alma the proportions by hand. 2 fists of clay, 2 fists of coarse sand, 1 fist of charcoal ash, a handful of dry grass torn into thumb-length pieces, and water added slowly, worked in with the heel of the palm until the mixture held its shape when squeezed but did not crack when bent. "Feel that," Estefania said, pressing a ball of the new mixture flat. It flexed. It did not split. When it dries, the grass holds it together like bones hold a body. When it freezes, the sand gives the ice room to expand without breaking the wall. Your father's mix was strong against heat. This mix is strong against cold. They tore out the cracked wall down to the 3rd course of stone and rebuilt it with the new clay. Estefania worked alongside Alma, not faster but steadier, placing stones with a precision that came from decades of building hearths, ovens, and charcoal pits. She did not talk while she worked. She hummed low, tuneless sounds that Alma eventually recognized as rhythm, not melody, the rhythm of placement: stone, clay, press, smooth, stone. The second lesson came that evening when the fire smoked. Alma had been building fires the size of a man's 2 fists, large enough to warm the chamber, but also large enough to overwhelm the smoke scar when wind shifted. Estefania watched the smoke roll sideways along the roof of the log and settle in a blue haze near the sleeping shelf. "Too much," Estefania said. She scattered the fire with a stick, reducing it to a pile of embers no larger than a dinner plate. Then she fed it 1 stick at a time, dry sticks, thumb thick, laid across the embers like rungs on a ladder. "Smoke is lazy," she said. "It sits unless heat gives it a road. A small fire makes hot smoke. Hot smoke climbs. A big fire makes warm smoke. Warm smoke wanders." She pointed at the scar overhead, where a thin column of gray now rose fast and straight. "Give the chimney hot smoke, and the chimney will pull." Alma watched the smoke climb and felt something shift in her understanding. She had been thinking about fire as a source of heat. Estefania thought about fire as a system: fuel, flame, smoke, draft, and exit, each piece dependent on the others. A larger fire was not better. A hotter fire at the right size with the right draft, in the right chamber, was everything. The 3rd lesson was vent discipline. "A winter shelter must be tight where wind attacks," Estefania said, pressing her hand against the new clay wall on the windward side, "but never sealed where people breathe." She tapped the intake vent, the fist-width gap Alma had left at the base of the stone wall, shielded by a flat rock that broke the wind before it entered. "This stays open, always. If you seal this, the fire eats your air. You will not wake up." She made Alma rehearse the check 3 times. Light a rag. Hold it at the intake. The flame bends inward. Good. Fresh air is entering. Hold the rag at the smoke scar. The flame pulls upward. Good. Smoke is exiting. Look at the ceiling of the log. No blue haze pooling. Good. The air's moving. If the haze pools, open the intake wider. If the haze does not clear, kill the fire and open the entrance. "You can survive cold," Estefania said. "You cannot survive air that has been breathed by fire and has nowhere to go." Alma practiced the check until her hands knew it without her eyes. Rag, intake, pull inward. Rag, scar, pull upward. Ceiling, clear. She would do this check every night for the rest of the winter, and she would teach it to every person who entered the log. The 4th lesson was thermal mass. Estefania heated fist-sized stones near the fire until they were too hot to hold. She wrapped them in strips of cloth and placed them beneath the sleeping shelf, tucked against the log wall. "The fire dies at night," Estefania said. "The stones remember." Alma pressed her hand against the wrapped stone. It radiated warmth the way a living body radiates warmth, steady, slow, persistent. She placed 6 stones beneath the shelf before she slept that night and woke 7 hours later with the stones still warm and the chamber at 44 degrees, even though the fire had burned to white ash hours ago. The 5th lesson was the door baffle. The crawl entrance was the weakest point. Every time Alma entered or left, cold air rushed in and warm air rushed out. Estefania solved this with 2 layers. an outer flap of bark slab, hinged with leather strips, and an inner curtain of doubled canvas, weighted at the bottom with a log. Between the two layers, a pocket of dead air formed, a buffer zone that broke the wind's direct path into the chamber. "The door is the mouth," Estefania said. "Two lips are better than one." They worked together for 6 days. During that time, Alma learned things she could not have learned from Merritt, because Merritt knew kilns and Estefania knew shelters. The difference was the difference between controlling heat and living inside it. Merritt could build a fire that turned limestone to powder. Estefania could build a fire that kept a sleeping woman alive through a night that would kill an exposed horse. Day 12, 3 days into Estefania's presence, the rebuilt wall held through a freeze that dropped the temperature outside to 21 degrees. The interior stayed at 46 with the fire banked. Alma checked the thermometer at dawn and let out a breath she had been holding since the first wall cracked. Day 14. Asa Pettigrew rode up the Grove Trail, tied his mare to a fur, and stood outside the log for a long time. He had come to criticize. He had heard about the rebuild, and he wanted to see if the new wall was any better than the old. He ducked through the baffle door and straightened inside the chamber and said nothing for 30 seconds. The fire was burning, thumb-thick sticks, Estefania's method, and the smoke was climbing clean, and the air was warm and dry, and the thermometer read 58 degrees. Asa looked at the wall. He tapped it with his knuckle. Solid. He pressed the joint between stone and clay. No flex. He checked the intake vent, the smoke scar, the sleeping shelf. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a bent stovepipe elbow, a piece of black iron shaped like an arm, salvaged from an abandoned cook shack on the road below. "For the chimney," he said. "If you seed it in the scar with clay, the draw will improve." He set the elbow on the ground and left without another word. He did not say the shelter was safe. He did not say Alma was right. He brought her an iron elbow for a chimney that he had told her she did not need, and that gesture said more than any sentence Asa Pettigrew could have constructed. Alma seated the elbow in the smoke scar that afternoon, packing Estefania's clay mix around the iron until the joint was airtight. When she lit the fire, the smoke did not wander. It leapt. The draft pulled so hard that the rag at the intake vent fluttered like a flag. Day 16. Phoebe brought 2 jars of apple butter, set them at the baffle door, and stood outside with her arms crossed. "I am not coming in," Phoebe said. "I know," Alma said. Phoebe looked at the steam rising from the smoke scar. She looked at the stone wall, solid and dark with cured clay. She looked at the baffle door, which was closed and sealed and showing no gap. "Is it warm in there?" Phoebe said. 54 degrees this morning," Alma said. "Before fire." Phoebe said nothing. She picked up her empty basket and walked back toward her cabin. But she walked slowly, and she looked over her shoulder twice, and the second time she was not looking at the log. She was looking at her own cabin's roof, where smoke leaked sideways from a pipe that had never drawn well. Day 18. Royce's hired man, a timber faller named Grieve who owed Royce for an axe credit, followed Alma from the cabin to the log and back. He measured the cabin, paced the distance between the door and the hearth, and made marks in a leather notebook. He was collecting evidence for the abandonment filing. Alma watched him from the tree line and said nothing. She could not stop him. She could only build faster. Day 20. The first full night inside the log with the wall complete, the baffle set, the chimney drawing, and 6 heated stones beneath the shelf. Alma woke before dawn with frost on the outer bark slab, but liquid water in the kettle. The thermometer read 42 degrees. Outside, a skin of ice covered the creek, and the snow had not melted for 3 days. She hung the thermometer back on its nail and sat in the dark with her hands around the warm kettle. 21 days since Estefania had found her at the clay bank. 11 days since the wall cracked and she had believed the math was finished. The wall held. The chimney drew. The stones remembered heat. The door breathed without leaking. The shelter worked. In mild cold, with a controlled fire, with the techniques Estefania had taught her, The log held warmth the way Merritt's kiln had held heat, not by generating more, but by losing less. But mild cold was not a Sierra winter. Mild cold was a rehearsal. The mountain had not yet decided to test her. The first real snow settled during the last week of November, not the tentative flurries that had come and gone since October. This was a patient, heavy snowfall that began at dusk and continued through the night and into the following afternoon without stopping. By morning, the trail between the cabin and the log was invisible. By noon, the snow reached Alma's hips in the drifts between the firs. By evening, the world had narrowed to the log, the clearing, and the gray wall of falling snow beyond. Alma made 2 last trips to the cabin through chest-deep snow, dragging the remaining beans and flour on a bark sled she had built from a Sequoia slab. Each trip took 3 hours. Her legs cramped, her back seized. She fell twice in the drifts and lay there breathing before she could push herself upright. On the second trip, she brought the last of the salt pork, a ball of twine, and her father's auger, and she did not go back. Everything she owned was now inside the fallen tree or buried under snow at the cabin. There was no shuttle between the two. There was only the log. The early performance numbers were Alma's only comfort, and they were real. Outside before dawn, 26 degrees. Inside before fire, 38 degrees. The log itself provided 12 degrees of insulation with no flame at all, just the massive thermal mass of bark and heartwood holding the previous day's warmth like a stone holds the sun's heat into evening. Inside, after 1 hour of thumb-thick fuel, 61 degrees. The fire Alma burned was laughably small by any cabin standard. An armload of deadfall twigs and branchwood gathered from the clearing and dried on the rack inside the log. A cabin stove would have consumed that fuel in an hour and demanded 3 times more. The log's fire burned it slowly because the chamber was small and the heat had nowhere to escape. After coals were covered and vents narrowed for the night, 54 degrees 3 hours later. The decline was gradual, 2 or 3 degrees per hour, and the heated stones beneath the shelf held the sleeping space warmer still. Alma could sleep 7 hours and wake to a chamber that was cool but not cold, feed the fire with kindling and a handful of twigs, and be back to 50 degrees within 20 minutes. The fuel economy was the quiet miracle, 1 armload of deadfall per night. A cabin at this elevation, even a well-chinked cabin, burned a quarter cord per week. Alma's shelter burned less in a month than Phoebe's cabin burned in a week. The math that had seemed impossible, 6 cords she did not have, had been replaced by a different math. Gather an armload of dead sticks each afternoon, and the fire would last the night. Estefania watched these numbers with the satisfaction of a woman whose predictions had been confirmed by a thermometer. But she warned Alma that warmth could deceive. A sealed room with a bad draft can kill a sleeping person without waking her, Estefania said. They were sitting inside the log on an evening when the snow had paused and the stars showed through the canopy gaps. The fire eats air. If the air does not come in as fast as the fire eats it, the fire makes poison instead of heat. You will feel sleepy. You will feel warm. You will not feel yourself dying. She made Alma rehearse the vent check again, the 3-part test she had taught on the first day. Flame bends inward at the intake. Smoke pulls upward at the scar. No blue haze pooling at the ceiling. Alma performed it with her eyes closed, by feel and sound alone, because there would be nights when the fire's light was too low to see and the check still had to happen. If you are ever unsure, Estefania said, open the door, lose the heat, gain another morning. Phoebe's younger boy, Milo, began visiting. He was 8 years old, fearless in the way children are fearless when they have not yet learned what should scare them. He had seen the smoke rising from the grove and had followed it the way a dog follows a scent, not because he understood what it meant, but because it was interesting. He crawled through the baffled door without asking permission and sat beside the fire with his mouth open. The log's interior was, to an 8-year-old, the most exciting room in the Sierra Nevada. It was dark and warm and smelled like smoke and cedar, and it was inside a tree. He scratched marks beside the thermometer with a nail, his own recording system, though Alma suspected the marks were decorative rather than scientific. Phoebe scolded him when she found out, dragging him home by the collar. But her anger shifted over the following days. She now worried not that Alma was mad, but that Alma might be right and still die before proving it. The distinction was important. Madness could be dismissed. Rightness that ended in death was a different kind of failure, one that indicted everyone who had watched and done nothing. Royce filed his abandonment notice on a Tuesday. The notice claimed Alma had deserted the improvement on the Whitcomb claim and had not occupied the cabin as a dwelling for a period exceeding 14 days. He needed a witness signature. Asa refused. Asa said he had not observed the cabin closely enough to testify, which was a lie. And Royce knew it was a lie. And Asa knew that Royce knew, and neither man acknowledged this because acknowledging it would have required Asa to explain why he had brought a stovepipe elbow to a woman he claimed not to be watching. Royce smiled his credit smile. "I have another witness," he said. Alma heard this from Phoebe, who heard it from the road crew, who heard it from Duthie, who had been drinking at the store when Royce said it. The chain of information was long and imprecise, but the thread at the end of it was sharp. Royce had found someone willing to sign, and when the road opened in spring, that signature would take the claim. A storm was building over the western ridge. Alma could feel it in the pressure behind her eyes, and in the way the jays had gone silent 2 days before the sky changed color. Estefania felt it too. She arrived at the log carrying dried yarrow, willow bark, and a bundle of tinder wrapped in oilcloth. "This one will be different," Estefania said, looking west where the clouds were stacking like gray stone. The storm arrived on a wet Thursday morning in the first week of December. It did not announce itself the way mountain storms usually do, with wind and then snow and then cold in that order. This storm brought all three at once. The temperature dropped 9 degrees in 2 hours. The wind came from the northwest, driving snow sideways through the grove with a sound like tearing cloth. The light went gray, then dark, then gray again as clouds thickened and thinned in waves. By noon, the trail from Phoebe's cabin to the creek was gone. By mid-afternoon, the creek itself was invisible under snow that had drifted 4 feet deep against the south-facing banks. The world contracted. Sound changed. The wind made the trees groan in their roots, a low, continuous sound that was more felt than heard. Alma sealed the baffle door, checked the intake vent, fed the fire, and waited. The thermometer read 67 degrees. Estefania sat on the sleeping shelf, sorting dried herbs into piles. Yarrow for fever, willow bark for pain, dried mint for the stomach. She moved calmly, the way a woman moves when she has survived storms before and knows that panic is a luxury she cannot afford. Then Alma heard shouting, not wind, not trees. A human voice broken by gusts coming from somewhere below the grove, somewhere on the trail between the clearing and Phoebe's cabin. The voice was high and thin and desperate, and Alma knew it was Phoebe before she could make out the words. She pushed through the baffle door into a world of white violence. Snow drove into her face. She could not see the edge of the clearing. She followed the voice downhill, wading through drifts that reached her waist, her thighs, her chest in the hollows between the firs. She found Phoebe 30 yards from the log, carrying Milo. The boy was limp against his mother's shoulder. His socks had frozen stiff, dark shapes crusted with ice below the hem of his trousers. His face was flushed, which meant fever, not cold. Phoebe's cabin roof had begun leaking meltwater onto the bed when the snow load pressed down on the shingles, and the stovepipe had started backdrafting in the wind, filling the cabin with smoke. Milo had fallen through creek ice that morning while playing. He had been wet and shivering for hours before the fever came, and when the cabin filled with smoke, Phoebe had no choice. "His feet," Phoebe said. Her voice was flat with terror. "Alma, his feet." Alma took Milo from Phoebe's arms. The boy weighed almost nothing. His skin was hot against Alma's neck, but his feet, when she pulled off the frozen socks, were white and hard below the ankle. She carried him to the log. She faced the choice that every shelter builder faces when the shelter is tested beyond its design. open the door and lose heat, or refuse entry and keep the chamber stable. There was no choice. She pulled back both layers of the baffle, and the cold rushed in like water through a break in a dam. The thermometer dropped from 67 to 51 degrees in the time it took Phoebe to crawl through the entrance. Alma felt the warmth leaving, physically felt it, the way you feel a held breath escaping. And she fought the urge to seal the door immediately. Estefania took command. She stripped Milo's wet clothing without hesitation, wrapped him in Alma's blanket, and positioned him on the sleeping shelf between two heated stones. She checked his feet, pressing the white skin with her thumb, watching for color change, finding none. She made a sound in her throat that was not a word but carried the meaning of one. Bad. Alma fed the fire. She fed it too much. 3 sticks, then 4, then a branch as thick as her wrist. The flames leapt, and the smoke, instead of climbing the chimney, rolled sideways along the ceiling of the log and settled in a gray blanket that made Phoebe cough and Milo whimper. "Small fire," Estefania said. Her voice cut through the smoke like a blade. "Hot throat, let the chimney pull." Alma scattered the excess fuel. She reduced the fire to embers and 2 thumb-thick sticks. The smoke thinned but did not clear. The wind outside was pushing against the chimney scar, fighting the draw. Alma grabbed her father's auger, climbed onto the sleeping shelf, and drove the bit into the char around the stovepipe elbow. She reamed the passage wider by a 1/4 inch on each side, punching through wet char and frozen bark while standing on the shelf with her head in smoke and her eyes streaming. The draw caught. The smoke lifted in a sudden rush, sucked upward as the widened throat gave the hot air room to climb. The haze cleared. Phoebe stopped coughing. Milo's breathing steadied beneath the blanket. Alma climbed down and checked the thermometer. 53 degrees and rising. She adjusted the intake vent, opening it slightly wider to feed the improved draw. And within 20 minutes, the chamber was back to 58. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether Alma built a shelter or a trap. The crisis was not finished, it was deepening. The stone and clay wall, Estefania's wall, the wall they had rebuilt with charcoal ash and coarse sand and grass fiber, began to leak. Not crack, leak. Wind-driven snow was melting against the outer face of the wall, where the log's residual heat warmed the stone, and the meltwater was seeping through the mortar joints and dripping onto the floor near the entrance. Each drip hissed when it hit the warm ground. Each drip carried cold into the chamber. Alma pressed clay into the seeping joints from the inside, while Phoebe held a candle close enough to see. The clay stuck, then wept moisture as the water pressure behind it built. Estefania told Alma to pack dry moss against the worst joints and let the moss absorb the water, rather than trying to stop it. The moss darkened and swelled, but held the drips to a trickle instead of a stream. Phoebe and Alma pressed warmed stones against Milo's feet. They wrapped his toes in cloth soaked with warm water and changed the wraps every 15 minutes, holding the boy's feet in their laps like something fragile and precious and possibly already lost. Milo cried when sensation began returning. "A good sign," Estefania said. Pain meant the tissue was alive. Silence would have meant it was not. Estefania made broth from beans and salt pork, heating the kettle on the stone hearth and feeding Milo with a spoon carved from a cedar shingle. The broth was thin and salty, and the boy drank it with his eyes closed and his hands clenched in the blanket. Outside, the storm was dismantling the mountain. Snow fell at a rate that buried landmarks within hours. The trail between the log and the claim cabin ceased to exist. Somewhere in the grove, a tree cracked, a sound like a rifle shot, followed by the slow, groaning crash of a trunk falling through canopy. Phoebe flinched. Milo did not react, which worried Alma more than the fever. Near midnight, Alma heard a different sound outside the baffle door. Not wind, not trees. The heavy stumbling crunch of boots in deep snow, and a voice, male, hoarse, calling a name Alma did not recognize. She opened the outer bark slab and saw Asa Pettigrew. He was covered in snow from his hat to his boot tops. His beard was white with ice. He was dragging someone by the collar, a man half his size, limp and stumbling, with one arm hanging loose and his fingers blue-white in the lantern light Asa carried. The man was Crispin Dow. Crispin was Royce's witness, the hired man Royce had sent to inspect the claim cabin during the storm, to document that Alma was not there to complete the abandonment case. Crispin had reached the cabin, found it empty and dark and half buried in snow, and had turned back toward Murphy's. The storm caught him on the open trail. He had collapsed a quarter-mile from the claim, unable to feel his legs, unable to see the trail, unable to do anything except wait for the cold to finish him. Asa had found him by luck. Asa had been riding toward the grove to check on Alma, something he would not admit to Royce and would not explain to himself, when his mare stopped and refused to move. Asa dismounted, walked forward, and nearly stepped on Crispin's body. Now the log held 6 people: Alma, Estefania, Phoebe, Milo, Asa, and Crispin. 6 bodies in a chamber designed for one, breathing air that a fire was also consuming, generating heat that the walls had to hold against a storm that was trying to tear the bark from the wood. Estefania looked at Alma. Alma looked at the intake vent, the smoke scar, the fire, the ceiling. She performed the check. Rag at the intake. It pulled inward, but weakly. Too many bodies, too much exhaled air, the oxygen balance shifting. She opened the intake wider, sliding the flat stone that shielded it an inch to the left. The rag pulled harder. Cold air entered low, swept across the floor, fed the fire, and the warm exhaust climbed the chimney. The haze at the ceiling thinned. She kept the fire low. She banked the coals, added 1 stick at a time, and watched the smoke. She opened the intake in pulses, wider for 10 minutes, then narrower, then wider again, reading the draft the way a sailor reads wind. When the rag fluttered strong and steady at the intake, the balance was right. When it sagged, she adjusted. Asa stripped Crispin's boots and found what Alma feared. The man's fingers were white to the second knuckle on both hands, and 2 toes on his left foot were the color of candle wax. Frostbite, deep enough that the tissue might not come back. Estefania treated him with warm cloths and willow bark tea, the same tea she was giving Milo. She did not waste words on comfort. She worked. Alma worked. Phoebe held Milo against her chest and watched the 2 women move around the chamber with the efficiency of people who had stopped thinking about whether this would work and had started doing what had to be done. Sometime after midnight, a sound came from the direction of the claim. A crack followed by a long, collapsing roar that shook snow from the canopy above the log. Alma did not know what it was until morning. Asa did. He had heard that sound before. "That was a roof," Asa said. His voice was quiet. "Snow load. Something just came down." Later, they would learn it was an abandoned shake hut on the trail below the claim, a miner's shelter that had not been maintained in 2 years. The snow had crushed it flat. If anyone had been inside, they would have been buried under 600 pounds of wet shingles and ridgepole. Asa sat in the warm dark of the log and listened to the wind and the fire, and the breathing of 6 people in a space that should have been a grave. He thought about his verdict, 6 cords or coffin, and he looked at the thermometer on its nail. 69 degrees, with 6 people and a fire no larger than a soup plate. By dawn, the storm began to thin. The wind dropped. The snow continued, but gentler, almost tentative, as if the mountain had made its point and was withdrawing. Alma fed the fire one last time and checked the thermometer. 75 degrees near the inner wall, where the bark was thickest and the thermal mass was greatest. Outside, the snow had sealed the exterior of the log in a white shell that added another layer of insulation. The temperature gap between inside and outside was nearly 50 degrees, maintained through the worst of the storm by a fire that burned 1 armload of deadfall and the body heat of 6 frightened people. Milo's fever had broken sometime in the small hours. His toes had color. He was sleeping against Phoebe's chest with his mouth open and his hands unclenched. Crispin's fingers were another matter. 2 of them, The index and middle finger of his left hand remained white and swollen. Estefania wrapped them in cloth soaked with yarrow tea and said nothing about whether they would recover. She did not promise what she could not guarantee. Asa sat near the entrance with his back against the stone wall and his hat in his hands. He had not spoken since the roof collapse. He was staring at the fire, the small, steady fire that Alma fed with sticks no thicker than a candle, and his face held an expression Alma had never seen on him before. It was the expression of a man revising every calculation he had ever made. The search party came 2 days later. There were 5 of them: Duthie the road crew foreman, 2 timber haulers, a blacksmith's apprentice from Murphy's, and a man named Coe who kept a mule string on the lower road. They had waited for the storm to break and then climbed through chest-deep drifts with shovels and a canvas litter, expecting to recover bodies. Duthie had told the others to bring extra canvas for wrapping. They reached the grove at mid-morning. The sky had cleared and the snow threw back sunlight so bright it hurt to look at. The sequoias stood in their white coats like pillars holding up the sky, and the silence after 2 days of storm was so total that the men could hear their own breathing echo off the trunks. Duthie saw the steam first. It rose from the scar in the upper wall of the fallen log, a thin column of white vapor, steady and clean, climbing straight into the cold air the way chimney smoke climbs from a well-built hearth. Steam, not smoke. The fire inside was banked to coals, and the moisture from 6 sleeping people was condensing as it hit the freezing air above the vent. "There," Duthie said. He pointed with his shovel. The men stopped. They stared at the steam the way men stare at things they cannot reconcile with what they expected to find. Steam meant warmth. Warmth meant living people. They had brought canvas for corpses and were looking at breakfast vapor. The baffle door lifted from inside. Warm air rolled out of the log mouth, carrying the smell of smoke, cooked beans, damp wool, and cedar bark. It hit the cold morning air and turned to fog. Through the fog, Alma Whitcomb's face appeared in the crawl entrance, soot-streaked and thin and very much alive. "Milo needs a doctor," Alma said. "Crispin needs one worse." The men helped Phoebe and Milo out first. Milo was walking, which was better than anyone had expected. His feet were wrapped in cloth and he moved carefully, wincing when the snow compressed under his weight. But he was walking. Phoebe held his hand and said nothing. Her face was the face of a woman who had spent 2 days inside a miracle she did not yet understand and was not ready to discuss. Crispin came out next, supported by Asa. 2 of Crispin's fingers were black at the tips. The tissue had died during the night despite Estefania's wraps and warmth. He would lose them, but he was alive, and the rest of his hands worked, and his feet had recovered color because Alma had kept heated stones against his boots through both nights. Estefania came out last, carrying her canvas bag of herbs and her manzanita walking stick. She looked at the search party, looked at the steam still rising from the vent, and walked past them toward the creek without a word. She had work to do. Survivors were not her concern. Clay was. Duthie stepped toward the log entrance. He crouched and looked inside. The fire ring glowed orange. The thermometer on its nail caught the light from the open door. The sleeping shelf was rumpled with blankets and pine boughs. The air inside was warm enough that Duthie felt it on his face before he entered, a breath of heat coming from inside a fallen tree in the middle of a Sierra winter. He read the thermometer. 61 degrees, 2 hours after the last feeding of the fire. "Lord," Duthie said. He said it quietly to himself, but the men behind him heard it. Asa was the one who spoke for the record. He stood outside the log with snow to his knees and his gloves in his hand. He had removed them inside the shelter and had not put them back on because the air inside had been warm enough that gloves were unnecessary. And he spoke clearly so that every man in the search party could hear him. "I told her 6 cords or a coffin," Asa said. "I was wrong about the coffin." The words traveled faster than the search party. By the time Duthie's men reached Murphy's that afternoon, the story had already begun to change shape in the telling. A woman survived a Sierra storm inside a hollow tree. No, inside a fallen sequoia, with a fire no bigger than a cook plate, with 6 people, a boy with frozen feet. Royce Ketchum's man, caught in the storm he was sent into. 75 degrees inside the tree, while the shake hut on the trail collapsed flat. Phoebe was the one who nailed the story to the ground with facts. She stood in front of the general store, not Royce's store, the other one, Vickers, and spoke to whoever would listen. Her voice was steady and her words were specific. My boy slept warm in that tree for 2 nights. His feet were frozen, and they came back because Alma kept stones against them. The fire was smaller than what I used to heat a pot. The air was warm, and the smoke went up, and the walls did not shake. My cabin leaked and smoked, and my boy nearly died in it. Alma's tree held. The practical questions came next. Men and women who had spent their winters fighting leaky cabins, smoky stoves, and woodpiles that never seemed large enough wanted to know how the tree worked, not because they intended to live in trees. The question was never about the tree. The question was about the principle. Why did the tree hold heat that their cabins lost? Alma answered by showing, not explaining. She brought Duthie and 2 other men inside the log, one at a time, and walked them through the design. She held the rag at the intake vent. She held the rag at the smoke scar. She pointed to the stone and clay wall and the baffle door and the heated stones and the sleeping shelf. She did not lecture. She demonstrated, and she let the men draw their own conclusions. How wide should the intake be? A man named Tolliver asked. Wide enough that the rag pulls steady, Alma said. If the rag hangs limp, the fire is eating air faster than air comes in, open wider. How far from the entrance should the hearth sit? Far enough that cold air falls before it reaches the fire. 6 feet works. The cold sinks into the trench here. She pointed to the shallow depression near the doorway, and the warm air stays above it. What keeps the smoke from falling? Heat. A small fire makes hot smoke that rises fast. A large fire makes cooler smoke that drifts. Small and hot. Always. The men left the log one at a time, blinking in the snow light, each wearing an expression Alma had seen once before, on Ace's face, in the dark, at the end of the storm night. The expression of people recalculating. The measurable results were specific and damning for anyone who had built a conventional cabin at this elevation. Alma had used less than 1/4 cord equivalent of small deadfall over the entire crisis period. 2 days and 2 nights of the worst storm the Sierra had delivered that winter. Phoebe's cabin, with its proper stove and split wood stack, had burned through nearly its full supply and still smoked and leaked. The log had stayed above freezing even when the fire was out for hours. Wet clothing hung on the willow drying rack had dried overnight. The comparison was not flattering to the cabins, and the men who had built them knew it. The numbers sat in the air like an accusation. Every family above Murphy's had spent autumn splitting wood, hauling wood, stacking wood, worrying about wood. Wood was the currency of survival, and the tax was brutal. A man could spend 3 weeks of autumn doing nothing but splitting and stacking, and by February the pile would be half gone, and the worry would be back. Alma had replaced that entire economy with an armload of twigs and a chamber that held heat the way a cupped hand holds water. The question nobody asked aloud, but everyone thought, what else had they been wrong about? Royce Ketchum's first reaction was denial. He stood behind his counter with his ledger and his clean collar and said that Alma had endangered others by luring them into an unstable structure during a storm. He said she had trespassed beyond the boundaries of her father's claim by occupying the log, which sat on land Royce claimed was part of his timber lease. He said she had used public timber unlawfully by gathering deadfall from Groveland. Nobody in the store responded to any of these arguments. The silence was not agreement. It was the silence of people who had just learned that Royce sent Crispin Dow into the storm to prove a woman was not sleeping in her cabin, and that Crispin had nearly died for the filing, and that the woman Royce was trying to evict had saved the man Royce had sent to destroy her. Crispin had talked. He had talked in the log, with Estefania wrapping his fingers and Alma feeding his fire, and he had talked again when the search party brought him to town. He told anyone who asked that Royce had hired him to inspect the cabin during the storm, He told them the terms, $5 and the cancellation of a mule shoe debt. He told them what he had found at the cabin. Nothing, because no one was there, because Alma had been inside a fallen tree keeping his employer's witness alive. Royce's leverage did not collapse. It eroded. The difference matters. A collapse is dramatic and final. Erosion is slow and humiliating, and the person being eroded can feel it happening and cannot stop it. Two families approached Alma within the week. The first was a miner's widow named Orr, whose cabin leaked from every joint and whose stove consumed wood faster than her 12-year-old son could split it. The second was a bachelor named Tolliver, who had been at the demonstration and whose fireplace had smoked since the day he built it. Alma did not tell either of them to live in trees. She walked into their cabins, held the rag near every crack, and told them what she felt. "Your windward wall has gaps you can see light through," Alma told the widow Orr. "Every gap is a throat that swallows heat. Seal them with mud and grass chinking, the same mix I use. Build a canvas wall across this room to make a smaller chamber. Heat the small chamber, not the big one. Your stove heats one room. Make the room fit the stove." She showed Tolliver how to build a mud baffle around his fireplace, a curved wall of stone and clay that forced the smoke upward instead of letting it roll into the room. She showed him where to cut a high vent in the wall behind the chimney so the smoke had a second path if the primary draw failed in wind. Estefania watched Alma teach and said nothing until they were alone in the log that evening. Then she said one thing that Alma carried for the rest of her life. "I taught Clay," Estefania said. She read the tree. The words were a correction. People had begun to credit Estefania for the shelter, the old woman who knew Adobe, the Californio with the ancient knowledge. Estefania refused the credit not because she was modest, but because it was inaccurate. She had taught Alma how to mix clay that survived freezing. Alma had recognized the tree as a shelter, designed the ventilation, built the wall, managed the fire for 6 people during a storm, and kept every person alive through 2 nights that should have killed at least one of them. The knowledge was collaborative. The vision was Alma's. The weeks after the storm were the deepest part of winter, and the log became Alma's workshop, classroom, and home. She improved it with the patience of a woman who had learned that patience was not a virtue, but a technology, the most efficient use of limited resources distributed across time. She built a stone-lined hearth inside the fire ring, setting flat rocks in a circle with clay mortar between them, creating a raised platform that reflected heat upward and kept coals off the charred floor. She lined the chimney throat, the smoke scar, and the stovepipe elbow with flat stones and a thick layer of clay, narrowing the passage so the draw would remain strong even in calm air. She built a second inner wall of mud and stone, creating a vestibule between the outer baffle door and the main chamber. The vestibule was a dead air lock, a pocket of still air that separated the cold outside from the warmth inside, so that opening the outer door did not immediately assault the chamber with wind. She cut a small shuttered window into a thin scarred section of the log's upper wall, using Asa's auger and a borrowed chisel. The window was no larger than a man's hand spread wide, but it admitted daylight during the short winter afternoons and could be sealed with a bark plug when the wind came from the wrong direction. Asa helped her frame it with strips of iron he had flattened from an old hinge. He did not explain why he was helping, and Alma did not ask. She created a raised food cache against the dampest wall, elevating the flour and beans on a platform of cedar poles so that moisture from the ground would not reach them. She marked vent settings on the inner wall with charcoal, labeling each position: storm, coals, sleep, crowded. The marks were not words. She used simple symbols that anyone could read by firelight. The teaching continued through December and into January. Alma helped Phoebe retrofit one room of her cabin into a smaller winter room, hanging canvas from the ceiling joist to create a false wall that cut the heated space in half. They chinked the windward wall with Estefania's clay mix, charcoal ash, coarse sand, dry grass, and packed the joints until the rag test showed no movement. Phoebe's stove, which had consumed a quarter cord per week, now heated the smaller room with half that amount. The savings in labor were immediate. Phoebe's son spent afternoons reading instead of splitting. She taught children to test drafts with thread. She showed Milo, whose feet had healed with 2 blackened toenails and a limp that would fade by spring, how to hold a length of cotton near a wall joint and watch for movement. Milo took to the task with the seriousness of a boy who understood, in the wordless way children understand, that the thread and the wall and the wind were connected to the night his feet turned white. Estefania's presence deepened through these weeks. And then it changed. She had been spending more time at the log, arriving early and staying late, teaching Alma refinements that went beyond survival into craft. They worked side by side the way 2 musicians play together, not in unison but in counterpoint, each anticipating the other's next move. Estefania would point to a joint in the wall and Alma would already be mixing clay. Alma would adjust the fire and Estefania would shift the intake vent to match without being asked. Estefania showed Alma how to temper clay for different purposes. A harder mix for the hearth, a softer mix for chinking that needed to flex, a waterproof mix that included rendered fat for sealing exterior joints against rain and meltwater. She showed her how to read smoke, not just whether it rose or fell, but what color it was, what it smelled like, what it told you about the fuel and the fire and the air. White smoke meant wet fuel. Blue smoke meant incomplete burn. Gray smoke rising fast meant the draw was good and the fire was clean. Gray smoke drifting meant the fire was dying or the throat was blocked. "You can tell a stove's health from across a meadow," Estefania said, watching a neighbor's chimney from the grove. "That one is burning green wood. That one has a cracked pipe. That one—" She pointed to a clean column rising from a cabin Alma had helped chink. "That one is healthy." They built a second drying rack together, larger than the first, using willow branches Estefania bent over her knee and tied with sinew. The rack hung from the ceiling of the log and could hold 4 blankets or 8 pairs of socks at once. It was a small thing, but it solved a problem that had plagued every family in the mountains: wet clothing in winter. A garment hung near a cabin stove might dry in a day. A garment hung inside the log, where warm air circulated slowly through the chamber, dried in 6 hours. The difference was the still air, no drafts to cool the moisture, no wind to chill the fabric before the heat could do its work. They disagreed for the first time over the chimney. Estefania wanted to narrow the throat further, arguing that a tighter draw would pull more consistently in variable wind. Alma believed the throat was narrow enough, and that further restriction risked backdraft when the wind shifted suddenly from the northwest, the direction that put the smoke scar on the lee side of the log. The argument lasted an afternoon. It was conducted through demonstration, not words. Estefania built a small model chimney from stacked stones and showed how a narrow throat accelerated the draw. Alma plugged the model throat with clay, simulated a wind shift by blowing across the top, and showed how the restricted passage forced smoke back down. "The tree is not an oven," Alma said. "An oven has one wind direction. The tree has every wind direction." Estefania looked at the model, looked at the real chimney, and conceded. She did it without resentment, with the quiet acknowledgement of a teacher who has seen a student surpass the lesson. She adjusted the throat back to Alma's specification and spent the rest of the afternoon teaching Alma how to build a rain cap from bark and clay, a different solution to the wind problem that did not require narrowing the passage. The disagreement mattered because it marked a shift. Estefania was no longer teaching Alma. She was collaborating with her. The relationship had changed from instructor and student to 2 craftswomen working the same material with different hands and converging instincts. In late January, Estefania crossed the creek to help a family named Hoff with a smoking stove. The creek was running beneath the ice, and the crossing, a log bridge that had been reliable in autumn, was slick with frozen spray. Estefania made the crossing in the morning, fixed the Hoffs' stove by rebuilding the baffle and chinking the pipe joint, and started back in the afternoon. She fell on the return crossing. Not into the creek, the ice held, but on the far bank, where a hidden root caught her foot and sent her down hard on her left side. She lay on the frozen ground for 20 minutes before Alma, who had been watching from the grove, reached her. The fall broke something inside Estefania that did not show on her skin. She breathed with difficulty that night and coughed blood the following morning. By the third day, she could not rise from the sleeping shelf without help, and her left side was bruised so deeply that the skin had turned the color of old plums from her hip to her lowest rib. Alma moved Estefania's bedding to the warmest part of the log near the hearth and kept the fire burning through the night instead of banking it. She made broth. She made willow bark tea from Estefania's own supply, the same tea Estefania had made for Milo, the same bark she had gathered from the stand of trees east of the grove, now brewed by hands that had learned the proportions by watching, not by instruction. She kept the vent check running every 2 hours, because the continuous fire ate more air than the banked coals, and the balance had to hold. Phoebe came when she heard. She brought clean cloth for bandaging and a jar of broth from her own kitchen, and she sat beside Estefania's shelf for an hour without speaking. When she left, she touched Alma's arm at the doorway and said, "She is proud of you." She would not say it. "But I can see it." Estefania did not recover. She lasted 11 days. During those days, she talked more than Alma had ever heard her talk, not about clay or fire or draft, but about her life before the mountains. She had been born in Monterey when California was still Mexican territory. She had married a vaquero who died of fever. She had built earth ovens for ranch houses, charcoal pits for iron smelters, and adobe walls for missions that were already crumbling when she was young. She had learned fire from her grandmother, who had learned it from Ohlone women who had burned the coastal hills for 1,000 years before any Spaniard arrived. "Fire is not yours," Estefania said on the 9th day, her voice thin as smoke. "You borrow it. You give it a house, and it stays. You give it a road, and it leaves clean, but it is not yours. Remember that when you teach." On the 11th day, Estefania asked Alma to open the bark shutter so she could see the sky. Alma opened it. Cold air came in. The thermometer dropped 4 degrees. Neither of them adjusted the vent. Estefania died watching winter light move across the charred ceiling of the fallen Sequoia. Her last breath fogged in the cold air from the window and then cleared. Alma closed the shutter. She adjusted the vent. She sat beside Estefania's body for 1 hour, holding the iron ladle that Estefania had left beside her bedding, a small, heavy thing, blackened with decades of use, still warm from the fire it had sat beside for 11 days. She buried Estefania in a shallow grave on the slope above the log, wrapped in canvas and covered with stones to keep animals away. The ground was frozen too hard for a proper burial, and Alma's hands were too damaged to dig deep. She used the axe to break the topsoil and the auger to loosen the subsoil, and she worked for 6 hours in snow that reached her shins, and she did not stop until the stones were stacked and the grave was sealed. Alma walked back to the log and hung Estefania's iron ladle on the nail beside the thermometer. She checked the vent. Rag at the intake, pulls inward. Rag at the scar, pulls upward. Ceiling clear. The fire burned. The walls held. The teacher was gone, and the student was alone, and the winter was not finished. For 2 weeks after Estefania's death, Alma worked in silence. She improved the shelter because the work steadied her hands, and because stopping meant sitting in the dark with the absence of a voice she had grown to need. She sealed a hairline crack in the vestibule wall. She rebuilt the food cache to hold more weight. She replaced the bark slab on the baffle door with a thicker piece, cut from a fallen branch and shaped with the axe. Each task was small. Each task kept her moving. Each task was a sentence in a conversation she was having with a woman who could no longer answer. The secondary crisis arrived in late February, when the mountain decided to test Alma's independence. A warm wind came from the west, a false spring, the kind that melts snow faster than the ground can absorb it. Creeks overflowed. The trail between the grove and Murphy's turned to mud and running water. Phoebe's cabin, which sat in a low spot near the creek, flooded 6 inches deep on the first night. 2 other cabins on the lower road took water through their doors. Alma's log shelter sat on a gentle slope, and the sealed mouth faced slightly downhill, so meltwater ran away from the entrance rather than into it. The chamber stayed dry. The hearth burned steady. The thermometer read 53 degrees on a night when Phoebe's cabin floor was under 6 inches of creek water, and the Hoff's root cellar had become a pond. But the community was not dry, and the community now looked to Alma the way it had once looked to Asa, as the person who understood what the rest of them did not. Phoebe arrived at the log carrying Milo on her back, her skirts soaked to the knee. Her husband was still on the timber road, unreachable until the mud dried. "The floor's underwater," Phoebe said. "The stove is out. The wood is wet. Every stick I own is soaked through." Alma brought them inside. She fed them broth and dried Milo's socks on the rack and gave Phoebe the sleeping shelf while she sat near the hearth and thought about what Estefania would do. She applied Estefania's lessons without Estefania. She built an emergency clay stove outside under a bark lean-to, a small structure, open on one side, roofed with sequoia bark slabs, with a clay-lined fire pit and a flat stone top for boiling water. The design was Estefania's earth oven principle, a contained fire with a hot surface and an open front for oxygen, protected from rain by the bark roof. She boiled water for the Hoff family, whose children were shivering in wet clothes. She dried blankets on the willow rack inside the log, rotating them every 2 hours so the warm air could reach both sides. She heated stones and wrapped them in cloth and sent them home with the Hoff's eldest girl, who carried them against her chest like hot water bottles and distributed them to her siblings. She showed Tolliver how to build a raised platform inside his cabin so his bedding would stay above the waterline, a simple frame of poles lashed together, elevated on stone footings, the same principle as Alma's sleeping shelf adapted for a cabin floor. She showed the widow Orr how to cut drainage channels in the frozen ground outside her door using hot water and a shovel, pouring the boiling water in a line and shoveling the softened earth before it refroze. For 3 days, Alma moved between the log and the flooded cabins, carrying tools and heated stones and clay and instructions. She ate when she remembered, slept in 2-hour shifts on the shelf, and kept the emergency stove burning under its bark roof through rain that would have drowned any open fire. By the time the thaw ended and the creek dropped back to its banks, Alma had lost 6 pounds she could not afford to lose and had gained something she could not have purchased, the certain knowledge that Estefania's lessons lived in her hands, not in Estefania's presence. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the weather turns. During the thaw, Royce Ketchum made his most aggressive move. He nailed a notice to a tree at the junction where the trail to the grove met the main road. The notice claimed that all foot traffic to the fallen Sequoia crossed his timber lease, and that any person using the trail owed Royce a toll of 25 cents, or would be charged with trespass. The claim was dubious. The trail had existed before Royce's lease, and timber leases in the Sierra did not typically include footpath rights. But Royce did not need the claim to hold in court. He needed it to discourage people from visiting Alma. If the families who relied on her teachings stopped coming, Alma's influence would shrink, and a woman without influence was a woman without witnesses. Asa read the notice, read it again, and tore it down. He walked to Royce's store and set the paper on the counter. "That trail was a mule path before you filed a single claim," Asa said. "I graded it myself in 1859. If you charge toll on a public right-of-way, the county magistrate will want to discuss your lease boundaries, and I do not think you want that discussion." Royce picked up the notice and folded it. "The road crew foreman has a long memory," he said. "Long enough?" Asa said. The notice did not reappear, but Royce's resentment deepened into something quieter and more patient. He was no longer trying to win quickly. He was waiting for spring court, where paperwork mattered more than reputation and where a man with a ledger and a witness signature could accomplish what winter had failed to do. Alma felt the threat the way you feel weather changing, not a specific event, but a pressure, a weight in the air that meant something was coming. She could not fight Royce with paper. She did not have a lawyer, a ledger, or a witness of her own who would sign a document. She had a fallen tree, a cracked thermometer, and the testimony of people who had survived inside her shelter. She had something else too, though she did not know its value yet. She had Crispin Dow, who owed his fingers, what remained of them, to a woman he had been sent to betray. She had Asa, who had torn down a notice and confronted a creditor, and who carried in his memory the exact moment his certainty had broken. She had Phoebe, whose boy could walk because Alma had kept stones warm against his feet through a night that should have killed them all. And she had, arriving on a broken sled in early March, a man she had not yet met, a Welsh wheelwright named Nolan Price, who would change the shape of the story in ways Alma could not predict and Royce could not prevent. Whether that would be enough depended on the spring, and the spring depended on the road, and the road depended on the snow, and the snow was still falling. Nolan Price arrived in the first week of March, dragging a broken sled behind a mule that looked nearly as tired as the man holding the lead rope. He was 29, Welsh-born, raised in a mining town where men built things underground and trusted them with their lives. He had come to California to build wagon wheels and had ended up repairing everything that rolled, slid, or pivoted between Stockton and the timber camps. He was lean, dark-haired, quiet in the way that men are quiet when they are listening rather than waiting to speak. He wore a leather apron stained with iron filings, and he carried, in a canvas roll behind the sled, a hand plane, a set of auger bits, 3 chisels, a draw knife, and a pair of iron hinges he had forged himself. The sled runner had cracked on the grade below the grove. Nolan had heard there was a woman above Murphy's who knew how to work with wood and clay and who might have a dry place to make a repair. He had not heard the full story. He did not know about the fallen Sequoia, the storm, the 6 people, the 75 degrees, or any of the rest of it. He knew only that his sled was broken and the woman was supposed to be resourceful. Alma met him at the grove entrance. She looked at the sled, looked at the crack, a split in the ash runner that ran 8 inches along the grain, and told him the repair needed a splice, not a patch. Nolan agreed. He had already reached the same conclusion. The agreement was the first thing that passed between them, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Mutual recognition of competence, delivered without ceremony. Alma let Nolan work inside the log because the light was better than outside. The bark shutter admitted enough daylight to see a grain line, seeper, and because the warmth kept the wood flexible for bending. Nolan crouched inside the chamber, planed the splice joint, and fitted the new piece with a precision that made Alma stop what she was doing and watch. He worked the way Estefania had worked, steadily, rhythmically, with hands that knew the material better than his words could describe it. He also looked at the shelter the way Alma had looked at his sled repair, with professional assessment. "The door is your weak point," Nolan said, not looking up from the runner. "Canvas and bark will not last a second winter. You need a frame. Hinged, with a proper seal." "The bark flexes with the temperature," Alma said. "A rigid door will warp and leave gaps. Not if it is built from quarter-sawn stock and hung on pintles. I do not have quarter-sawn stock. I have a draw knife and a straight-grained log outside that is not going anywhere." Alma looked at him. He looked at her. The conversation had the shape of an argument and the temperature of a negotiation, and underneath both of those things was something neither of them had expected to find in a fallen tree 15 miles above Murphy's in the last month of winter. Nolan stayed 3 days to finish the sled repair. During those 3 days, he also built a prototype door frame from a cedar plank he split with the draw knife, hung it on one of his iron hinges, and fitted it into the crawl entrance. The door was too small, and the hinge was too stiff, and the frame warped overnight when the temperature dropped. But the principle was sound, and they both knew it, and the argument about how to fix it kept them talking until the 3rd evening, when Nolan loaded his repaired sled and told Alma he would be back with better stock. He came back 10 days later with a wagon load of dried pine boards, a second set of hinges, and a bag of iron nails he had pulled from a collapsed bridge on the lower road. He did not explain why he had returned. He did not need to. The door needed building, and the door was an excuse, and they both understood the excuse for what it was without acknowledging it aloud. Their courtship was conducted entirely through technical disagreement. Nolan wanted to improve the log with boards and iron, a proper door, a framed window, iron brackets to reinforce the sleeping shelf. Alma insisted the tree's shape must be respected. Its curves were part of the insulation, its bark was part of the wall, and cutting into it with saws and planes would weaken the structure that kept the heat inside. They compromised the way craftspeople compromise, by building prototypes and testing them. Nolan built a door. It warped. He built another, thinner, with a canvas gasket around the edge. It held. Alma accepted the door. Nolan proposed a plank floor. Alma refused. The charred wood beneath them was dry and warm, and a plank floor would create a cold gap underneath. Nolan accepted the refusal. They built a hinged window shutter together, arguing about the angle of the hinge for an entire afternoon before Nolan set it and Alma tested it with the rag and declared the draft acceptable. By the time the snow began its final retreat in late March, Nolan had become a fixture in the grove. Not living in the log, not yet, but present often enough that Phoebe raised an eyebrow and Asa cleared his throat, and even Milo, who noticed everything, asked Alma if the wheelwright was going to stay. "I do not know," Alma said. It was the most honest answer she had. Spring court convened in Murphy's in the second week of April, in a room above Vickers's store that served as courtroom, meeting hall, and occasional dance floor. The magistrate was a man named Felton, 54, a former surveyor who adjudicated land disputes, debt claims, and petty offenses for the upper county. He was neither kind nor cruel. He was precise, which was worse for anyone whose case depended on vagueness. Royce Ketchum arrived with his cowhide ledger, his clean collar, and a prepared statement claiming that Alma Whitcomb had abandoned her father's claim, endangered neighbors by housing them in an unsafe structure, and used public timber unlawfully by gathering deadfall from groveland that fell within his lease boundaries. The room was full. Word had traveled. People who had never met Alma had ridden up from the lower camps to hear the case, because the story of the woman in the tree had become the story of the winter, and winters in the Sierra are long enough that stories matter. Royce presented his case first. He was calm, organized, and specific. He produced the ledger showing Merritt's debt. He produced the abandonment notice with its dates and its claim that Alma had not occupied the cabin for more than 14 consecutive days. He produced a document asserting his timber lease covered the ground where the fallen Sequoia lay. He did not mention Crispin Dow. Felton listened without expression. Then he asked for testimony. Asa Pettigrew stood first. He was not comfortable speaking in front of a room, and his discomfort was visible in the way he held his hat, turning it in his hands like a wheel he could not stop. But his voice was steady, and his words were specific. "I told Miss Whitcomb in October that her cabin could not survive a winter," Asa said. "I told her she needed 6 cords of wood and did not have one. I was correct about the cabin. I was wrong about the woman. She maintained the claim throughout the winter. She improved the cabin's hearth and door before moving operations to the Grove shelter, and she traveled between the 2 locations throughout the season. I personally observed her hauling supplies between the cabin and the shelter on multiple occasions. She did not abandon the claim. She expanded it." Royce objected. Felton overruled him with a look. Phoebe Mallory stood next. She did not turn her hat because she did not wear one. She stood with her hands flat on her skirt and her chin level, and she spoke the way she had spoken outside Vickers's store in December, with the authority of a woman who had carried a fever-sick child through a blizzard and knew exactly who had saved him. "My boy Milo fell through creek ice and took fever," Phoebe said. "My cabin flooded and smoked, and I could not keep him warm. I carried him to Alma Whitcomb's shelter in the grove. He slept warm for 2 nights in a fallen tree while the worst storm of the winter buried the road. His feet were frozen, and they came back because Alma kept heated stones against them through the night. My cabin failed my boy. Alma's shelter saved him," Felton wrote. The room was silent. Royce stared at his ledger. Crispin Dow stood last, and the room shifted. Everyone knew what Crispin was going to say. The only person who seemed surprised was Royce, though his surprise was not genuine. It was the performed surprise of a man who had rehearsed every possible outcome and was now watching the worst one unfold. "Mr. Ketchum hired me to inspect the Whitcomb cabin during the December storm," Crispin said. He held up his left hand. The index and middle fingers ended at the second knuckle, the stumps healed but visible. "He paid me $5 and canceled a mule shoe debt. I was to confirm that Miss Whitcomb was not occupying the cabin, so the abandonment filing would hold. I reached the cabin. She was not there. I turned back. The storm caught me. I collapsed on the trail. Asa Pettigrew found me and brought me to the shelter in the grove where Miss Whitcomb and Doña Estefania Robles treated my frostbite and kept me alive for 2 days. He paused. He looked at Royce. I lost 2 fingers because Mr. Ketchum sent me into a storm to file a paper. I kept the other 8 because Miss Whitcomb let me into a tree. The room exhaled. It was not a sound anyone made deliberately. It was the collective release of breath that happens when a truth that everyone has known privately is finally spoken aloud. Nolan Price stood at the back of the room and produced one more piece of evidence that Royce had not anticipated. It was a repaired sled ledger, a record of goods Nolan had transported between the claim cabin and the Grove shelter throughout the winter, documented by date, weight, and item. Flour, beans, tools, nails, canvas, the cracked thermometer. The ledger showed continuous activity between both sites, proving that Alma had maintained the claim as an operating base even while living primarily in the log. Nolan had compiled the ledger from Alma's own notes, marks she had scratched on the interior wall of the log each time she made a trip, recording the date and the load. He had transferred them to paper, organized them by week, and presented them as a transport record. It was not a legal document. It was better. It was evidence of labor, measured and dated, that no foreman or magistrate could dismiss. The marks on the wall of the log were still visible. Alma had not erased them, had not thought to erase them, because they were not records to her. They were the scratched history of a winter spent walking between 2 shelters in snow that reached her chest, carrying everything she owned on her back. Nolan had recognized them for what they also were: proof. Felton reviewed the ledger. He reviewed Royce's lease boundaries. He asked Asa about the location of the fallen Sequoia relative to the claim line. Asa, who had graded the trails himself in 1859, testified that the log sat within 50 yards of the claim's western edge, and that Royce's timber lease, filed in 1871, did not extend to that section of the grove. He produced his own memory as evidence: the distances, the landmarks, the direction of the trail he had cut 17 years earlier. Felton wrote it down. The magistrate's ruling was brief. He refused the abandonment claim. He noted that Miss Whitcomb had maintained continuous use of the claim property throughout the winter, that the Grove shelter constituted an extension of the claim's operational footprint, and that Mr. Ketchum's lease boundaries did not include the disputed area. He further ordered that Merritt Whitcomb's debt be marked as satisfied, citing community labor credits, hauling work, road clearing, and emergency assistance during the December storm that exceeded the balance owed. Royce stood at the table with his ledger open and his clean collar suddenly looking like a noose. The room watched him. He closed the ledger. He picked up his hat. He walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. He did not turn around. "A tree is still no house," Royce said. Asa, who was sitting near the window with his hat finally still in his hands, answered him. "No," Asa said, "but it was more house than yours gave her." Royce left. The door closed behind him. The room did not celebrate. Celebrations require the belief that the contest was close, and this had not been close. This had been a man with a ledger against a woman with a thermometer, and the thermometer had won. People filed out quietly, nodding to Alma as they passed, some touching her arm, some saying nothing because the verdict had said everything. Phoebe embraced her at the door. Asa put his hat on and walked to his mare and rode home without looking back. Nolan stood at the bottom of the stairs and waited. The months that followed moved faster than the winter had, the way time always moves faster when you are building something instead of surviving something. Alma and Nolan married in autumn in a small ceremony near the meadow at the edge of the grove. Asa stood as witness. Phoebe brought apple butter. Milo carried the rings on a cedar shingle he had sanded smooth himself. The ceremony was brief and practical, like the couple. They spoke their vows standing in grass that was still green from the late rains, and the giant sequoias stood behind them like witnesses from a different century. The marriage was a partnership before it was a romance, and it remained a partnership after the romance deepened. Nolan built, Alma designed. He understood wood and iron the way she understood clay and heat. He built doors that sealed. She taught him why the seal mattered. He framed windows that opened. She showed him where the windows should face to avoid the worst winter winds. Together, they turned the fallen Sequoia from a survival shelter into a winter station, a place where people came when the mountain turned hostile. Their first winter together tested the partnership in ways the ceremony had not prepared them for. Nolan wanted order, tools hung on pegs, wood stacked by size, a schedule for vent checks posted on the wall. Alma worked by feel. She knew the fire needed feeding before the thermometer confirmed it, the way a mother knows a child's fever before the hand touches the forehead. They argued about the drying rack. They argued about where to store the flour. They argued about whether the intake vent should be measured by inches or by the behavior of the rag. "The rag tells you more than a ruler," Alma said. "A ruler tells the same thing every time," Nolan said. "The rag tells you what the wind decided today." "That is the point," Alma said. They settled the argument the way they settled every argument, by building two versions and testing both. Nolan marked inch measurements beside the intake vent. Alma kept using the rag. By February, Nolan was using the rag. He did not admit this. Alma did not mention it. The marks remained on the wall, unused beside Alma's charcoal symbols. Storm, coals, sleep, crowded, which had proven themselves through 2 winters and did not require revision. The log became known locally as Whitcomb's warm log. Alma kept a chalkboard nailed to the interior wall beside the thermometer, recording daily temperatures, fuel consumption, and repair notes in a hand that grew steadier and more confident with each passing month. The chalkboard was not sentiment. It was data. The same data that had saved 6 people during the storm, now extended across seasons, proving day by day that the principle held. 3 neighboring cabins adopted inner winter rooms based on Alma's design. Canvas walls, clay chinking, smaller heated chambers inside the larger structure. The fuel savings were immediate and measurable. Families that had burned 5 cords per winter now burned 3. Families that had spent October splitting wood now spent October hunting, preserving, building, doing the work that winter had always stolen from them. Asa helped build 2 public storm shelters near the main road, using the principles Alma had demonstrated. Thick walls, small chambers, controlled vents, high chimney draw. The shelters were crude, log frames packed with mud and stone, not fallen sequoias. But they held heat the way Alma's log held heat, because the principle did not require a giant tree. It required understanding where heat goes when you are not holding it. Phoebe became a teacher in her own right. She showed women in the lower cabins how to chink walls and test smoke draw without waiting for male labor. She carried Estefania's clay recipe: charcoal ash, coarse sand, dry grass. Water worked slow to families who had never heard of Estefania and would never know her name, but who would use her mortar to seal their walls against the wind. The clay mix entered local speech as Robles mortar. Estefania's name attached to the material the way a maker's mark attaches to a tool, not through advertisement, but through use. People asked for Robles mortar the way they asked for pine tar or tallow candles, by name, without knowing the woman behind it, knowing only that it worked. Alma and Nolan raised 2 children, a daughter born in 1875 and a son born in 1878. The children grew up in a cabin Nolan built on the claim Sa, a proper cabin, chink tight with Robles mortar, heated by a stove Alma designed with a throat that drew clean in any wind. The fallen Sequoia remained their winter station, their classroom, and their emergency shelter, and the children learned to check the vents the way other children learned to check the stove, as a daily habit, automatic and essential. Alma never became wealthy. The claim produced enough to feed a family and pay modest debts and keep tools in repair. She spent winters teaching practical heat-saving methods to anyone who asked, and the asking never stopped. Each year brought new families to the mountains, and each family brought the same problems Alma had faced: leaky cabins, smoky stoves, wood piles that shrank faster than they grew. She answered the same questions year after year with the same patience, because the questions did not change, and the physics did not change, and the cold did not care whether you had heard the lesson before. She developed a routine. In October, before the first snow, she walked any cabin that asked for inspection. She carried a ball of thread, a lump of clay, and the iron ladle Estefania had left her. The thread found the drafts. The clay sealed them. The ladle served no practical purpose on these visits, but she carried it anyway. A talisman, a reminder, a debt she could not repay and did not try to. She taught families a three-step winterizing method that any person could perform without special tools. First, seal the windward wall, hold thread at every joint, and where the thread bends, press clay. Second, build an inner room. Hang canvas or blankets from the ceiling joists to cut the heated space in half. Third, test the chimney, burn a twist of grass, and watch the smoke. If the smoke hesitates, the throat is too wide or the draw is too cool. Narrow the throat with stones. Feed the fire hotter, not bigger. The method was not revolutionary. It was not even new. Estefania had known it, and Estefania's grandmother had known it before her. What was new was the teaching. Alma did not wait for people to come to her. She went to them. She knocked on doors. She crawled under cabins. She climbed on roofs. She did the work that men with engineering knowledge rarely did. She brought the knowledge to the place where it was needed, rather than requiring the need to find the knowledge. Nolan built a larger door for the log in 1880, with double hinges and a gasket of felted wool that sealed so tightly the rag test showed no movement at all. He built a set of iron vent covers that could be adjusted from inside the chamber with a lever, replacing the flat stones Alma had used for 7 years. He built a small iron stove, no larger than a bread box, that sat inside the fire ring and burned with an efficiency that would have made Estefania nod in silent approval. Royce Ketchum did not disappear. He remained in Murphy's, running his store, holding his leases, extending credit to new arrivals the way he had always done, carefully, patiently, with the quiet confidence of a man who believed that money was a form of memory and that ledgers outlasted reputations. He and Alma did not speak. They passed each other on the road and in the store, the way planets pass each other in orbit, aware, distant, governed by forces larger than personal grudge. Royce's resentment did not heal. It calcified, which is what happens to emotions that are never examined. He carried it the way he carried his ledger, close, organized, and ready for use. But time does strange things to calcified resentment. It does not soften it. It buries it under layers of ordinary life, store transactions, Sunday dinners, conversations about weather and road conditions, and the price of nails, until the resentment is still there but the energy to act on it has been spent on other things. Royce grew older. His collar stayed clean, but his hair thinned, and his hands developed a tremor that made writing in the ledger slower than it used to be. He did not become kind. He became tired, which resembles kindness from a distance. The final conversion came years later, during a January storm in 1886. Royce's nephew, a young man named Colvin, who had come west to learn the timber trade, was caught on the road above Murphy's when the storm closed the grade. He stumbled off the trail, lost his horse, and wandered in circles until he saw a light. The light came from one of Alma's retrofitted rooms, the widow Orr's former cabin, now owned by a family named Pfaff, who had sealed it tight with Robles mortar and heated it with a stove throat Alma had designed. Colvin survived the night in that room. He arrived in Murphy's the following day with all his fingers and toes intact, telling anyone who would listen that the Pfaff cabin was the warmest building he had ever entered, and that the family had fed him soup and shown him how the draft worked, and that the whole system was based on something a woman named Whitcomb had taught them. The story reached Royce. What Royce felt when he heard it, whether shame or relief or something too complicated for either word, is not recorded and probably was not understood even by Royce himself. What is recorded is this. 2 weeks after the storm, a freight boy delivered a package to Alma's cabin. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and tied with store twine, was the iron ledger plate from Merritt Whitcomb's debt book. A flat piece of stamped iron, 3 inches by 5, with Merritt's name, and the number $11.60 pressed into the surface. The edges were worn smooth from years of handling. Attached was a note in Royce's handwriting, the letters slightly trembling with the hand tremor he had developed. For the woman who kept account better than I did. Alma held the plate in her hands for a long time. She turned it over. She read her father's name. She read the debt amount, $11.60, the sum that had nearly cost her the claim, the mule, the tools, and her life. She did not cry. She did not smile. She carried the plate to the fallen Sequoia. Alma did not forgive Royce. Forgiveness would have required a conversation, and Alma did not believe Royce had earned one. She climbed the exterior bark to the smoke scar and nailed the plate above the entrance where it blocked a thin line of wind that had persisted since the first winter. A hairline draft she had never been able to seal with clay because the gap shifted with the seasons as the bark expanded and contracted. The iron plate fit the gap exactly, as if it had been made for it. The draft stopped. The gap closed. Merritt's debt, stamped in iron, finally did useful work. Estefania's ladle hung on the nail beside the thermometer. Asa's stovepipe elbow seated in the chimney throat. Nolan's hinges on the door. Royce's iron plate in the wall. The log held the contributions of every person who had touched Alma's life, assembled not by plan but by accumulation, the way a shelter is built, one piece at a time, each piece answering a specific need, the whole greater than any single hand could have made it. By the time Alma was 50, 27 families had learned some version of her winter room method: mud chinking, inner chambers, controlled vents, small, efficient fires. The fallen Sequoia did not become a tourist trick. It did not appear in the brochures that advertised the Calaveras big trees to visitors from San Francisco and beyond. It became a working memory, a place children were taken to learn why smoke must climb and why warmth must be held, not chased. Milo Mallory, who had nearly lost his feet inside the log at age 8, brought his own children there at age 20 and made them hold thread near the intake vent and watch it bend inward. He did not explain the physics. He did not need to. The thread explained itself. Alma lived out her later years above Murphy's, on the same claim Royce had tried to take. She kept Merritt's cracked thermometer wrapped in cloth, bringing it out for every first snow the way other women bring out holiday decorations. Not for the measurement, which was no longer accurate, but for the memory of a man who had pressed his palm against a kiln door and taught his daughter where heat goes when nobody is watching. She outlived Asa, who died in 1893, with his hat in his hands and a half-finished storm shelter on his property. She outlived Royce, who died in 1902 with his ledger balanced and his collar clean, and not a single person in the county who called him generous. She did not outlive Nolan, who would survive her by 6 years, maintaining the log shelter in her absence the way a widower maintains a garden. Not because it needs it, but because the work is a form of conversation with someone who is no longer there. Alma died in 1911, aged 61, after one last winter in which Nolan found her sitting near the log entrance on a January morning, listening to sleet strike the bark. Her hands were in her lap. Her eyes were on the grove. The thermometer inside the log read 44 degrees, and the fire had burned down to coals, and the smoke was climbing clean through the scar where Asa's stovepipe elbow still held after 38 years. Nolan brought her home. He hung the cracked thermometer on the nail where it had always hung, beside Estefania's ladle and the charcoal vent marks and the chalkboard that recorded 4 decades of temperatures in a hand that never wavered. He closed the baffle door. He did not seal it. The log still breathed. Sleet on harness leather. Flour in the snow. A woman standing outside a store with no credit and no witness willing to speak for her. Royce Ketchum's voice across a pine counter, calm as a closing door. A woman alone does not keep a winter claim. The mountain answered for her, not with philosophy, not with sentiment, with evidence. Alma's hand pressing clay into a seam, feeling the draft stop beneath her fingers. Milo's frozen socks steaming on the willow rack while his mother held his feet in her lap. Asa removing his gloves inside a fallen tree in December and staring at a thermometer he did not trust. Estefania's ladle hanging beside the vent marks, blackened and warm, outlasting the woman who carried it by decades. Royce's iron plate nailed above the entrance, blocking the last thin line of wind, doing useful work for the first time since it was stamped. Years after Alma's death, snow filled the old wagon ruts, and the trail above Murphy's disappeared under white. But inside the fallen Sequoia, a child held a thread near the low vent and watched it bend inward, pulled by warm air rising, by a draft that had been drawing clean since 1873, by a principle as old as fire and as simple as a sealed crack. The mountain kept its cold. Alma Whitcomb taught people where not to let it enter.